Hi, I'm the Brewmaster. I've heard it said that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is simply Magic the Gathering, but in the vintage format, with a command zone. And I wanted to put that to the test. So today I want to build a deck using cards from Magic the Gathering, with the deck building rules of Yu-Gi-Oh! And see how close we get to the modern gameplay patterns of the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! If that sounds interesting to you, pull up a chair, have a seat at the table, and whether you're a button mash hack and slash controller bash or a meeple moving mastermind of maps, mats, and minis, if you ruffle at the awful riffle shuffle scuffle, or if you're a click clack pick attack number ball luck sack, we're all here for the same reason. I'm Jake, let's talk games. Alright, so before we really get into this, I want to take an opportunity to talk about the way that Yu-Gi-Oh! Decks are built. Essentially, the rules are that you have a deck between 40 cards and 60 cards, and you are limited to only 3 copies of each card that's included. Now, this can be reduced by their restricted and banned lists. Some cards you can only play 1 copy, some 2, and some are banned outright. There's a lot of cards that just don't fit with the game, either rules-wise or power level-wise, and so they are banned. You can't use them at all. In addition to that 40 to 60 card deck, you have an extra deck of 15 cards, and that has a lot of the other colored monsters you might have seen. And they usually have special summoning requirements, whether that is using a spell in your deck to bring them out, or some requirement of monsters in play that you will then sacrifice, overlay, return to your hand, whatever the case may be, to bring those things from the extra deck into play. It works very similar to the command zone in Magic the Gathering, with the exception that there are 15 of them. And because the mana cost aren't the same, they don't go back to the extra deck when they die like they do in Commander. Finally, there's a 15-card sideboard. We're not really going to get into that. It functions exactly the same as it does in Magic. Technically, it's called the side deck, but it is the exact same purpose, and it functions the same way. That's about it. So if we look at Magic and we say that we're using the vintage ban list, so that includes all the cards, has certain cards that are banned, certain cards that are restricted, I think it mimics the Yu-Gi-Oh! Ban and restricted list pretty well. I think that there would probably be cards on the ban and restricted list in Magic that would be removed, given this 15-card command zone that we're building. And then just for the sake of keeping things consistent, we are going to use the command zone rules from Commander, where it can only be legendary creatures, and otherwise everything works exactly the same. They all have mana costs. They don't go back to the command zone when they die, but otherwise they work just like your Commander would. We are restricting cards to 3 copies unless they are further restricted by the vintage ban list. And we are going to be building a 40-card deck. Otherwise, gameplay is identical. And if we know the results that Commanders had on the community, just changing the deck construction rules can have huge impacts on gameplay and the way that people kind of engage with the game. So let's start talking about the way that we build the deck, which cards are good, which cards don't really fit anymore, and just kind of the way the gameplay would change given these new restrictions. So I will be the first to say that I am neither an enfranchised vintage player or an enfranchised modern competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Player. As you see in front of me, I have a fairly tuned Generators deck that can hold its own but kind of gets blown out at real competitive tables. And then I have a Cyber Dragons deck that I think is kind of a good way to demonstrate the way that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is played. I have a handful of other decks that are generally even lower powered than that. So nothing that's really competing for tier 1, a couple of rogue things that can catch people off guard, but that's about it. And then in Magic, I have a proxied out vintage Dredge deck that is now a few years old, and so it doesn't really resemble the modern Dredge decks, and I haven't played in a vintage event in probably a decade, so I am fairly out of touch with kind of what the new modern metagame is. In pulling up some decks that are used in modern tournaments and looking at the way that they're constructed and which would most easily map into the Yu-Gi-Oh! Style of game, I landed on the Paradoxical Outcome deck. And I really like the way that that interacts with returning things to your hand and replaying them. You get a lot of the tutor and playing a bunch of cards in one turn feel that I think you get from Yu-Gi-Oh! And opening up the command zone with creatures, I think, introduces a level of complexity and flexibility in the deck that we don't see, and it allows us to do some relatively interesting things, especially with our win condition, because we no longer have to have something explicitly in the deck to win the game. Once we get the board locked down and kind of get our combo rolling, we can rely on that extra deck, the command zone, to really close things off. Like I said before, we're not reducing any of the mana requirements or any of the other gameplay aspects of Magic. So let's start talking there. Typically in a game of Magic, when you're building a 60-card deck, you are looking at between 20 and 24 land. Some decks go a little higher, some decks go a little lower. But within that range, that's typical. So we're probably looking at about a third of the deck being land. The way that this deck is constructed, having a lot of mana rocks and running all of the Moxen, you need fewer lands than that. So I have reduced the number of lands to be included to about 11, and you can see them here. The flexibility of the lands essentially is trying to get us off the ground as fast as possible, and with this being largely an artifact deck, our lands are mostly in service of getting those artifacts into play as fast as possible. We're running lands that tap for multiple amounts of mana, and because we have a significantly smaller deck, we can hit them a little more consistently. So I think we are doing pretty good with the 10 lands that we have included here. So next, let's get to the artifacts and have a look at what those do. Now, because this is a paradoxical outcome deck, the whole aspect of the deck centers around the card paradoxical outcome. And essentially when you cast it, you can return any number of things you have in play to your hand to draw that many cards. Our goal will be to go mana positive on casting that, bouncing a bunch of free artifacts to our hand that make mana, replaying all of them, hopefully drawing into another paradoxical outcome to do it over and over to draw through our entire deck and get to one of several combos that allow us to close out the game or generate enough mana to go into our command zone. So in our artifacts, as you can see, many of them tap for mana, and that's the entire name of the game, right? We're running all of the Moxen, we're running Black Lotus, we're running everything else that we can use to tap for mana to get into our combo as fast as possible. One of the recent additions to this deck is the One Ring coming out with the Lord of the Rings set, and it's had a pretty serious impact in literally every format, and it's still good here. Moving away from the artifacts for a second, we can get into some of our other spells that we cast. So walking down the line, under creatures, we have a selection of Phyrexian Metamorphs, which just copy some of the things that we have in play and allow us to double up on some of our effective cards. They act as copies 4, 5, and 6 of some of the things that we really care about, and they allow us to really generate value, which is the goal. Under sorceries, we have Tinker and Time Walk, pretty classic. These are just to generate value. And the Tinker can go grab either the One Ring or one of our other artifacts, depending on where we're at in the combo and what we're trying to accomplish. Additionally, it can grab the Phyrexian Metamorph if that's relevant. So getting into the instance here, we have 3 copies of Paradoxical Outcome, which is our main combo enabler. We have 3 copies of Force of Will to just stop our opponent in whatever they're doing. Hopefully we can kind of catch them off guard at one of their critical junctures to stop them. But otherwise, it's a good card to always have on hand. And finally, we have 1 copy of Ancestral Recall because it is the best card in Vintage. Command Zone. All of our legendary creatures, with the goal being to end the game. These are the cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! That you use to close out the game, lock your opponent down, and really finalize whatever the strategy is that your deck is trying to accomplish. Now, our deck does have a couple of things in the main deck that can stop our opponent from doing things, most notably the Vault Key combo, which allows us to take infinite turns, and then we can take our sweet time getting to whatever we want to do. But ultimately, we are trying to spin up enough mana to get into our command zone and pull out a couple creatures that can end the game for us. Starting at the top of the list, we have the big girl herself, Emrakul, the Promised End. Now, this frequently does just end the game if we can get up to the mana for it. The other thing that's unique about Vintage is we are putting so many cards into our graveyard over the course of the game that typically she's going to have her cost reduced a bit, and so that we don't have to get up to that full mana, even though we technically can with the amount of mana rocks that we do have in the deck. Moving down the list, we have a couple of other cards that generate value for us and allow us to draw extra cards. We have a handful of cards that restrict what our opponent can do, either by affecting which cards can be played or the mana costs of those cards. And typically, we are going to be setting up these cards onto a blank board or onto an fairly uncontested board if we are able to go ahead with our game plan of countering what our opponents do. If our opponent does have a couple of things in play that are causing issues for us, it changes our response a bit, but we do have some tools in the extra deck to try to combat that. Ways of removing those cards and destroying them. Finally, a couple of cards in the extra deck are there just for early game play so that we have things to do aside from trying to get into our combo. If we stall out, we still have some pieces that we can put into the board, slow our opponent down, or generate additional value for ourselves to try to close out the game. If you look at this in terms of actual gameplay, typically we are going to be rushing towards the combo by getting artifacts into play quickly, getting paradoxical outcome going, and generating enough mana to put a couple of threats into play that stop our opponent from doing things. In many of these cases, we do have to pass the turn and have something up to deal with our opponent, but with the amount of counterplay that we have, I think we're fairly secure on that front. If our opponent is going first, then on our turn it becomes a little more dicey because they are setting their pieces down, but hopefully we had enough counterplay during their turn to slow them down or stop them at a critical junction to where we can continue with our combo unabated. I think that falls pretty in line with the way that Yu-Gi-Oh works. There's a bit of variation from being a 2-turn, 3-turn format to a 5-turn, 6-turn format, depending on which decks are popular at any given time. But typically, you need to have something you can do in the first 1 or 2 turns. Otherwise, you are just completely out of the game. And I think that this deck that we've built using Magic cards ticks a lot of those boxes and plays in a lot of the same ways. So I hope this was an interesting little thought experiment of how we build a sort of Yu-Gi-Oh deck using Magic cards and how that would play on the table. This is something that I like to think about because I think these two games have a lot of crossover with each other, but in my experience, there's not a lot of people that play both. So if you do play both and you're more experienced than I am, please let me know how you would approach this puzzle, because I think that there are other vintage decks that definitely work really well in this deck construction, and I think you might be able to do interesting things with Dredge and some of these other vintage staples. And maybe the way that mulliganing doesn't exist in Yu-Gi-Oh! But does in Magic might cause weird gameplay issues. And I don't think this is the sort of thing where you could play a Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck against a Magic deck. That's not really the goal. But using these alternative deck construction rules, I think we could build a whole new type of competitive vintage Magic that does some really unique things and steps away from some of the other aspects of vintage that I think people shy away from. So let me know what you think. Let me know how you would approach this puzzle of building a Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck using Magic cards and what that might look like. If there's anything I missed for a way to build something completely broken or busted, I want to know about it because that sounds awesome. So let me know, and it's been really nice talking to you.